Have you ever wondered why we call kids minors? The word itself seems to suggest they're somehow less than adults, and historically, that's not far from the truth. The story behind this term is deeply tied to a dramatic and often dark period in American history, a time of immense social change, industrialization, and a desperate need for labor. Let's travel back to the 1800s and early 1900s to uncover this forgotten chapter. But for many, the reality was grim. Poverty, disease, and hazardous living conditions were rampant. In these chaotic urban centers, a heartbreaking crisis was unfolding. A massive population of orphaned, abandoned, and destitute children. They were often called street Arabs, a derogatory term for children who survived by their wits on the streets of cities like New York. At the time, the legal concept of childhood was very different from what we know today. Children were often seen as miniature adults, their value measured primarily by their ability to work and contribute to the family income. The idea of a protected, innocent childhood was a luxury few could afford. For these street children, life was a daily struggle for survival. Enter a Presbyterian minister named Charles Loring Brace. Horrified by the conditions he witnessed, he founded the Children's Ed Society in 1853. Brace believed that the city was a corrupting influence, and that the best hope for these children lay in the wholesome environment of the American countryside. He had a radical idea. Why not send these children west to live with farming families who needed an extra pair of hands? This was the birth of the orphan train movement. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from crowded East Coast cities to rural homes across the Midwest and beyond. The process was quite a spectacle. Children would be gathered, cleaned up, given new clothes, and put on trains heading west. At each stop, the train would be met by crowds of local townspeople. The children would be lined up on a stage at the local opera house or town hall to be inspected by prospective families. It was essentially a public auction. Farmers would look them over, check their teeth, feel their muscles, and ask them questions to gauge their strength and usefulness. The selection process was often cold and pragmatic. Siblings were frequently separated, sent to different families, and in many cases, never saw each other again. The children had no say in where they went or who they lived with. They were simply placed. Now, was this a benevolent act of charity or a system of cheap labor? The answer is complicated. For some children, the orphan trains were a lifeline. They were placed in loving homes, received an education, and grew up to lead successful lives. They escaped the crushing poverty and danger of the city streets and were given a chance they never would have had otherwise. Many descendants of these orphan train riders today share stories of gratitude for the opportunities their ancestors were given. However, for countless others, the experience was traumatic. The term adoption, as we know it, didn't really exist. These were indenture agreements. The children were expected to work as farmhands or domestic servants in exchange for room and board. Many were treated not as family members, but as laborers. They faced abuse, neglect, and exploitation, their childhood stolen by endless, back-breaking work. They were, in essence, a source of cheap, disposable labor for an expanding agricultural frontier. The term minor in this context underscored their legal status. They were dependents, property of the adults who took them in with few rights of their own. Simultaneously, another force was shaping the lives of children in America, the Industrial Revolution. As factories, mills, and mines sprang up across the country, they created an insatiable demand for workers. And who were the cheapest workers available? Children. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly 2 million children under the age of 15 were part of the American workforce. They worked in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. In coal mines, young breaker boys would sit for hours on end, separating slate from coal in dusty, dark tunnels, their fingers often mangled by the machinery. In textile mills, small children, some as young as 6, would crawl under massive, fast-moving looms to fix broken threads, risking being crushed. In canneries and glass factories, they worked long shifts, exposed to hazardous chemicals and extreme temperatures. Their small size and nimble fingers were seen as assets. They could fit into tight spaces adults couldn't. And more importantly, they could be paid a fraction of an adult's wage. They had no power to unionize or protest. Legally, they were minors, under the control of their parents or employers, and their labor was seen as essential for both family survival and industrial profit. Their economic contribution was their primary identity. The concept of a child's intrinsic worth, separate from their ability to work, was still a radical idea. But a shift was beginning. Reformers, journalists, and photographers started to expose the horrors of child labor. Louis Hine, a photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, traveled the country documenting the grim reality of children at work. His powerful, haunting photographs shocked the public conscience. Pictures of exhausted, grimy-faced children staring blankly from mines and factories brought the issue to the forefront of national debate. This growing public outrage fueled a long and difficult fight for reform. Activists argued that childhood should be a time for education and play, not for dangerous labor. They fought for compulsory education laws to get children out of the factories and into the classrooms. They pushed for legislation that would set minimum ages for employment and limit working hours for children. This was a battle against powerful industrial interests who relied on cheap child labor. The first federal child labor laws were passed in the 1910s, but were struck down by the Supreme Court, which argued they interfered with states' rights and the freedom of contract. It was until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that federal protections against oppressive child labor were finally and firmly established. This act marked a monumental shift in how American society viewed children. It legally separated childhood from labor. For the first time, federal law recognized that children minors were a special class of citizens deserving of protection, not exploitation. It helped solidify the modern idea of childhood as a distinct and protected stage of life. So when we use the word minor today, it carries the weight of this complex history. It evolved from a term that defined a child by their lack of legal and economic power, a worker, a dependent, an asset to one that signifies a protected status. It reflects a societal journey from viewing children as miniature adults valued for their labor to recognizing them as individuals with the right to a safe and nurturing childhood. The stories of the orphan train riders and the child laborers are a stark reminder of how far we've come. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our nation's past and the long struggle to define the very meaning of childhood. It's a history that shaped our laws, our social safety nets, and our fundamental understanding of a family. The next time you hear the word minor, remember the millions of children whose lives are woven into its meaning, the children who worked in mines, rode the orphan trains, and ultimately paved the way for the rights and protections that children have today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.